All right, guys, we're back doing our intersection of music and philosophy. It seems like as the weeks have progressed, we have less and less prepared for this, and it's more freewheeling. I don't even know if we have a topic for this one, so maybe we'll name the topic after it. I know that you have some things that are intriguing to you. I have something that's sort of intriguing to me, as far as I've noticed within.
hmm
Um, Maybe they'll end up matching up. Maybe we'll just talk about what's intriguing to you the entire time, or maybe they feed into one another.
No, we'll start with yours.
You want me to start with mine?
Yeah, and then maybe we can kind of go from there.
Okay, sure. All right. So the thing I think something that I've noticed about me, and in regards to the crossroads of music and philosophy, is that I'm getting really frustrated with pop music, and for the longest time, I just ravenously consumed everything so much that I had this very encyclopedic knowledge of everything that could be considered rock, indie, hip hop, whatever you want to call it.
hmm
And I treated my listening sessions, which were occurring all the time, anytime that I wasn't doing any sort of intellectual writing, as like an educational experience where I was sort of breaking down a lecture, and then I would then cannibalize those things. So when I went into the studio and made my own songs, I could recombine them and make something new and generate something novel. Now that I'm not really interested in making pop songs anymore, I feel like I've kind of proven myself in that respect, and I'm viewing my identity as a musician as evolving and doing more freeform things. And I've united my entire mind around philosophy. I have little patience for pop music. I get very frustrated with it. Songs that I've heard before disgust me. Songs that are highly repetitious, I have no time for. And I find that if there are musical art forms that I'm still interested in, it's going to be either ambient things that fit well with the process of thought, philosophical composition, surprising jazz or whatever that I practice to, or the much more, I guess, the hyper stimulating, what is to me hyper stimulating classical music. So anything that like nicely fits a template is utterly uninteresting to me now. I'm not putting the music under the microscope as much to detect the details, to get the emotional significance of every note and every word.
hmm
I'm becoming an old man. It's becoming like a racket to me, and I'll say, just to finish it out. So as I get more and more into philosophy, my appreciation for classical grows and grows. So I wonder why that is happening. Is it the hyperstimulation of philosophical music, of philosophy, that makes it so that I can only really gravitate towards an art form that I find to be almost as stimulating, or if not the same amount of stimulation? And similarly, what was the other point that I wanted to make? Oh, I've also noticed that when I do want to take a break from philosophy, when I think I went for a walk today, and I said to myself, um, I think I should listen to some music today rather than more philosophy. And I put on David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest, and so I'm now considering literature to be a form of music. So I'm having this weird sort of mental shift where templated music is no longer interesting, and I'm viewing literature as music, and I'm seeing if there is a form of actual music that I'm curious about. It's classical, and it seems like classical is sort of this musical interpretation of philosophical ideas. So that's
Would
it.
you say that your thought process is very similar from when you were digesting popular music as you were when now you're digesting classical music? Because it almost seems as if you're kind of taking that cerebral approach and just kind of moving it towards something different. And that maybe it's not necessarily the music that's changing, or that it may. I mean, I think that's what you're getting to, is that you're implying that you're changing,
I am
and then
changing.
you're viewing it as disgust. So I don't know if maybe it's the music that's frustrating. Maybe it's just your view of it has changed, or maybe that you're taking the really cerebral approach that you took with popular music and just kind of shifting it to classical music. And I wonder what that says about maybe.
Well, I would say this: the cerebral. I was totally consuming all that pop music for the ends of sort of my own sort of creative production, and that entire skill set I'm realizing was draining away from my philosophical activity and productivity, and now I've united. I've taken that skill set and put it totally towards the written word, and so my brain hasn't shifted so much, but that cerebral sort of process of agonizing over every letter and every this and every that is has now been shifted back to philosophy. So I was a man of two minds for a while, and now I'm wholly united.
I wonder though if whether you'll find the same thing might happen with philosophy or any of these things, is that you'll just kind of get so hung up in the details that then you'll shift and you'll say, oh man, this doesn't give me the satisfaction. Maybe some text or maybe even literature or whatever doesn't give you the satisfaction, and then you have to go back to pop music, or whether we always just kind of shift from one thing, go to the other, shift from one thing, go to the other, that maybe we'll like a certain music, and then we'll quote unquote hate it, go to another, and then we'll kind of, and then we'll go to the other. So whether maybe our tastes are never just this static thing, you know. I mean, maybe when somebody says like, "What kind of music you're into?" you should be like, "I don't know what music." Or everybody says, "Oh, I'm into everything, man." That's kind of the common response. Or maybe there is truth to that. I mean, maybe it's just like we always our tastes are always changing, and that we can't really say where we're gonna go next.
Well, I think what's interesting to me is that philosophy and literature have become music for me. Mm-hmm. The question is like, what do I if I were to transcend out of that, what would I transcend into? Would I relapse back into music? Would music become music again? Or would I transcend into theology, poetry? I think that's interesting. There have been a number of philosophers who have had sort of a break with philosophy. Probably the most notable is Wittgenstein.
What did he do instead?
He taught kindergarten. He wrote the Tractatus, and he's like, yeah, I figured all the major questions of philosophy out, and he didn't know what to do with himself. He came from a very wealthy family, so he was financially taken care of, and he achieved everything he wanted to achieve within the academic system. So he went and taught children, and in the process of doing kindergarten or whatever, he sort of had this. He rethought a lot of his previous positions, and then I don't know how long it was, 8 or 10 years or whatever. He went back to philosophy and kind of experienced the second act. So I don't know. I don't know.
That's a really fascinating kind of trajectory. Where maybe did you feel that doing pop music, or at least having that music experience that you did, make you interested in the written word, or at least in philosophy literature, again, maybe in a different respect, maybe in the same way that maybe Ludwig Wittgenstein did? Or
I definitely think that philosophy affected more of my musical compositions. I think that but I don't know how music really affected my philosophy, except from the fact that I think it may have detracted from it.
Or you don't think that?
I think now it's positively affecting it, because I think a lot of the technology and methodologies that I learned as a music producer and things like that, I'm trying to synthesize with academic philosophy so as to bring more people to the table. But I don't know what about writing songs and things like that would have the positive effect it would have had on my philosophical production outside of the technological aspects of it.
Maybe we shouldn't be talking about that specifically, because I don't know if you think of like Wittgenstein going to kindergarten. I don't think necessarily that, oh yes, doing arts and crafts has made me want to come back to philosophy. You know what I mean? Where like the technical, like, yes, arts and crafts, story time, like I'm ready to write another treatise on philosophy
Yeah,
now
yeah.
after, but I feel like maybe for him, and maybe I'm generalizing, and maybe this isn't really written. Maybe it was like the mind frame of interacting with these kids, perhaps, and maybe their approach and questions that they gave within these parameters, like story time or whatever, made them think about things differently, and made him think about things differently. So I'm wondering then if your time in music and being within a scene.
Yeah.
And I mean, I've experienced this too, so I think maybe I can relate, maybe not in the same vein as you, but maybe the camaraderie and the kind of do-it-yourself sort of spirit of a small community maybe made you think of your philosophy differently. Maybe that's what I'm asking. Maybe not so much in the sense of like forming pop songs, but in the general kind of...
Yeah, and I would say that's completely true. Because if I don't make that distinction, it makes it sound like that I'm very bitter about the time that I spent with music. And that's not the case at all. And I think you're hitting on you're hitting the nail on the head. And it's precisely that. Like a lot, by doing music very seriously, I learned there was a certain warmth that was generated to my humanity that I think gets snuffed out when you do academic philosophy. I think it preserves sort of my outsider status, and I think that will serve me well in the long run. Maybe not in the short run, but I think it will serve me well in the long run. And I think it probably infused me with an approach that I wouldn't have otherwise gotten had I just stayed within the confines of regular academia. So not only am I deeply indebted to my time spent in music to think about things anew in terms of audiovisual things and web development and app creation and things of that nature, but I'm also very indebted to it in terms of like logistical orchestration, building a community, building a scene, getting a number of individuals to logistically sort of harmonize around a common trajectory. I especially sort of experienced that when I was, any project that I've really done, that's been the nature of it.
I think that's really cool. At least that we're touching on this idea that everything you do kind of affects what you are doing. And that sounds very obvious to say. I don't know if you think of philosophy too. I mean, I remember you telling me about Kant and how, what was he? He was what did he do before philosophy? He was a mathematician.
I don't know if you would properly call him a mathematician. He was a lecturer. He was a lecturer on a number of subjects. I mean, So, I mean, look, I mean, the thing is there's more specialization now with philosophy. So like, but I mean, even at his time, I mean, it wasn't really that problematic for, I don't know. I don't always say that.
This is another interesting thought trail to go to. Maybe a different example.
Just to historically clear things up.
Please do.
Yeah, he did lecture on mathematics. He did lecture on geography and metaphysics and things like that. And it wasn't until later that he really started to be productive in his writing, and that's when he, I think in his like 50s and 60s and whatnot, he started to do his most famous works.
And maybe we like to think that's a culmination of all the activities that he's done, and that
it most definitely was. Like if you think about if you think about it, so what do you do when you study geography, right? I mean, like you think about the contours of things.
Yeah.
You think about what the boundaries are.
Boundaries, yeah.
Of countries. Yeah. So it's no coincidence that one of Kant's books is Religion Within the Bounds of Mere Reason, right? Mm-hmm. And I don't think it's really any coincidence that the Kantian project is largely about reining in reason, right? Mm-hmm. So like imposing limits, like reason will function up until this point, but then no more. It's almost like he's sort of, I don't know, doing some sort of philosophical cartography and saying, reason, you stay within this little principality. Yeah. And I think I think the time spent lecturing on geography probably affected the way that he saw reason functioning,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe this has something to something that the topic that you maybe wanted to address a little bit about sort of the.
I like going where we're going.
Oh, okay, sure.
No, I mean, and I can think of also Descartes too. I mean, being a mathematician, and then kind of saying like, okay, I'm going to start like tabula rasa, like what do we know for sure? Almost like, okay, like 1 + 1, like doing a proof, almost like doing a proof in the sense where it's like we got to start with what we know, and then we got to like keep adding from there, like that kind of like really just like mathematical kind of thinking.
Yeah.
But I mean, and it's interesting too with like Wittgenstein too, where I mean, I know like with little I know of him, and please.
No, I don't know. I don't know a lot more about Wittgenstein.
Oh, you probably know more than
I know more
do.
about. I know more about his biography than I do his philosophy.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, a lot of his work on language. I don't know if that was after his little like.
I think it was always sort of. I think the Tractatus is, and that's really the only work that he published was. I think really concerned with that, but
language. Yeah, but I would assume that working with even kids as well, like
sure.
I mean, because language is almost like kind of in its, not saying in its infancy, but I mean we learn about language, and maybe kids are curious about language. Like when you say something, kids sometimes don't know what you're talking about, or they make conclusions that are just kind of like really odd. I remember my one of my teachers at school talks about his daughter. And
I think you brought her up once before.
Yeah, about, like, where she
her sense of time.
Her sense of time. She thought yesterday. I mean, he was talking about something that happened
like a week ago.
And she said it happened yesterday, and he says, "No, honey, that happened last Wednesday." She's like, "No, yesterday," and then he kept saying, "No, it's Wednesday." She's like, "Yesterday," and he's like, "Yes, honey, it happened yesterday." But like that idea where it's just like, oh, is the concept of time something we just kind of fabricated, and is like, isn't everything yesterday? Where like these profound truths can happen within this kind of inquiring, mind of a kid, and maybe like having that sort of experience, especially when teaching kids, maybe Wittgenstein learned more from them than he taught to them.
But so he when he did go back, he never really wrote another book. He did write something that was, I don't know if it came out posthumously, but it was called Philosophical Investigations. I believe it did come out posthumously, and it's his lecture notes that were assembled by his students.
Nice.
So, but the Tractatus, I believe, was his, and don't quote me on any of this stuff. I'm not a Wittgenstein scholar, but from what I understand, he really only released one thing.
Okay.
So like stuff kept coming out like Tupac or something like that,
No,
but I think this is interesting. I mean, look, I think it says something to have spent a considerable part of your life doing something else can really provide really wonderful insights into the philosophical works that you do. You mentioned the mathematician. Math has had such a profound impact on philosophy. It's not.
You were talking about David Foster Wallace, who spent a good deal of his time on logic and everything too. And
yeah. But yeah, I mean, definitely Descartes and Leibniz, Bertrand Russell.
The guy.
Yeah. I mean, I could go on and on and on. There are a number of people who've devoted so many of their years to mastering math, only then to have it really play out in different ways in how they do philosophy. So I guess, as the great song says, the rest remains unwritten. I don't. We'll see how this whole my time in music plays out in the philosophical work I generate. I don't really see myself as a researcher anymore. I see myself as a pedagogue. Like I'm really just interested in educating. Mm-hmm. But maybe, anything is possible. Like maybe I have some major breakthrough in studying all these different thinkers and teaching everybody where I'm just like, oh my God, they're all saying the same thing. Let me show you how they're all integrated.
Sure, or maybe you might do a philosophical text about music. I mean, not to.
I could do a cultural one.
Yeah,
I think I could
you
do
could
a
do maybe
cultural
more
one.
of a cultural text where maybe you talk about percussion, or at least maybe you just do kind of like a personal exploration on your
The
life
pop
as
song,
or the pop song, or your life as a drummer that maybe is almost kind of like what we're doing with Barth's Camera Lucida, or like how Barth kind of just like, I'm going to take a subject and I want to explore it. Maybe you could do the same thing where it's almost kind of like part philosophical text, part kind of memoir, part this, part that, and just taking everything that you've read and just kind of.
well, I actually think what we do could feed into a book of that nature as well, because I think we so seamlessly transition in between these podcasts, between improvised music in the basement and improvised conversation. I think there's probably a rich sort of fertile exploration area about music as conversation and what that means and what conversation means. I mean, that topic alone could probably be generative of a small little book.
No, and I think that's a really interesting point to note too, is that even if you take something from another field to your field, you're not necessarily just working. Just because I take something from philosophy to music doesn't actually mean I'm like making music. I could be writing about music,
Yeah.
where maybe a guy takes something and uses it in philosophy, but he's not necessarily maybe not writing about philosophy. Maybe he's just teaching, like you're talking about Wittgenstein. Maybe he just taught at a university level, but he used what he did at, when he was teaching the kindergartners, and used it in his own works. I mean, and that's another really fascinating thing too, is that fields aren't just limited to the obvious what they are, or we think of, oh well, philosophy is just written down word and oral tradition, like just talking. It's talking and writing down things. Like, it's not necessarily just that. And music, oh, it's just performance. It's not necessarily just that either. And maybe that can lead, and having that kind of realization might also lead to further pollinating between different mediums and different things that we do, where everything can kind of can affect what we do. Because if we don't look at our field as just one, like I just make music, I go to shows to make music, and I go to the recording studio to make music, where it's like, oh, maybe I can write about music, I can participate in open discussions on music, I can have a podcast on music, I can do a fanzine, I can organize shows, I can organize little lectures. I mean, if you take all these different things and then use your own kind of random field of knowledge, where it's like, oh yeah, I once taught at a kindergarten, and then you kind of like, oh wait, well what we did was really cool, like interactive, fun things, like participatory things. And you're like, oh, let me try and put that in a concert setting. Like, oh whoa, maybe that would be like a really crazy insight.
Yeah.
I mean, so I think maybe I'm just advocating for a more holistic kind of viewpoint.
Yeah, I
feel like a lot of the stuff that we've noticed maybe has been kind of, or at least great thinkers like a Wittgenstein or a Descartes, Kant, whoever. We could even say Schiller, because he's a poet, and then he kind of did his philosophy stuff, and maybe he was still thinking about it. But
yeah, who knows if had he not dedicated himself so much to art, would he have come to his aesthetic conclusions?
No, and would he have been able to write such a great little book, or a great little series of letters, and in such a kind of poetic way, if he wasn't a literary figure before?
I think the interesting question for me is, like, if I ever did do another sort of massive research text again, why would that be preferable than trying to learn what other thinkers who I perceive to be greater than myself are, or what they're saying, is what I'm trying to say. What they're saying, trying to learn it for myself, and then trying to conceive of that in such a way that it's accessible to the masses.
That almost sounds like the musical equivalent of like, why should I write
music
if I can play the greats and maybe have people compose music for me and play that, and just to be an advocate for a constant kind of, maybe more of like a mindset. And again, I think that goes back to the idea where it's like it's more of a mindset than anything, maybe, where it's like you can do whatever, but you can't just look up, you can't just, I guess, do research on on philosophers and what they thought, but through that lens that you have, you can, and then through lens, I guess I mean also your experiences, whether, I guess, like, again, you were a mathematician, you were a cartographer, you studied geography, whatever, all those experiences kind of create your lens, whether, I guess, through that lens, you can do something different, I guess, even just looking up, even if it's not just like considered completely quote unquote new, it's not just like Luke Johnson, like, I'm going to tell you what I believe, or like, this is an album of completely original music by me. That maybe it's more just like a mindset. Yeah. Maybe that's what.
Well, I don't. The thing is, I do have that itch scratched a little bit, because like when I do the lectures and the podcast and stuff like that, I do include my own analysis, my own conclusions in it. So I do feel like I offer up new ideas, and there are many times throughout the podcast with you and Jordan where I'll just be like, hey, this would be a cool research project for somebody. Go get your master's and do that. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But I don't pursue it to its logical conclusion. And then, I mean, over the course of doing this podcast, I've probably come up with like 20, 20 ideas.
That's a really interesting kind of concept. I know there's some writers have done that actually. Two I can think of is like Jorge Luis Borges and a sci-fi writer named Stanislaw Lem, who they both kind of done, at least for like short stories, they've done book reviews of books that don't exist.
Mm-hmm.
So they can create these really complicated, wild books or these crazy concepts, but not take it to the logical conclusion like you're saying. So it's kind of interesting in that.
They don't have to go and write the 500-page book. They can
but they can talk about it. But sometimes that's all you need.
Yeah.
Right. They're like, you don't need to read. You don't have to write. And I think that's what you're kind of getting at too. Where it's like you don't have to write a 500-page book to get some kind of crazy idea out, or to get an interesting concept out, for somebody to understand it.
And maybe that's where the future of philosophy is. I mean, if you had asked me like a year ago about like where in the modern American economy, like where do individuals create innovation and new industries and new jobs and new economic opportunities, I'd be like, you know what, my generation, your generation, we're kind of screwed. I would have said something to the effect of, all the opportunity has been swallowed up, and you can't just go out there and start your own thing anymore. And that was an incredibly narrow perspective. And then when I sort of had my mind opened up to this limited space, it's like when I could see this light pulled back about this emerging technology with apps, and then I pulled on that more and went deeper into it. I could see that all these cottage industries now I'm just having I'm having tech ideas all the time.
Now, do you think that has to do with expanding your frame of how you look at things, where it's like, I guess like we're getting at, where it's like having these different perspectives are almost kind of ways to open that curtain to be able to have more opportunity, more ideas, more perspective? I
think I saw a beam of light emerging from a seam and an otherwise stagnant economic model. I think I just ripped it open, and then I went into it. I think similarly, you could probably say something about philosophy. Because it's very frustrating the way that academic philosophy is right now, and it's that individuals make the most minute dent in the field. You could have individuals spend their entire lives just advancing one single idea, and then they die on the altar of philosophy saying like, okay, I was the one who discovered this thing about, I don't know, Spinoza, right? And like, that's your life.
Mm-hmm.
And you have done a great service to the discipline, but like, that's a lot to exchange your life for, you know, or a little, I should say. It's a little to exchange your life for. I guess how I'm wondering is similarly, if there are little beams of light that we can rip open and pursue new philosophical pathways. I mean, I think the Barth text that we're doing right now in that course that we're building is a fantastic example of that. No philosopher that I know of had ever thought to train their rational thinking upon the art form of photography. I mean, who's to say that you couldn't do you like you were saying earlier in the thing, like why you all right, so maybe everyone said everything important about Spinoza already.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe all the big ideas, all the big ethical thinking has been done already by Kant or whoever else, and this and that. But maybe there are these new emerging fields. I mean, whenever there's a new technology introduced, or maybe there are things that philosophy is just totally neglected for its entire existence. It was so preoccupied with metaphysics and ethics and religion
Mm-hmm.
that maybe it never took seriously musical composition, never,
Yeah.
or maybe not adequately enough. Maybe there are just wide open areas for research.
And it might be,
just need to turn around.
Yeah,
Like,
or it might
like,
be a different way of looking at things too. Because
Yeah.
I mean, I think something interesting we have to realize, and I think we'll talk about it in the Barth, is that he's looking at it through the lens of semiology, or like semiotics, like the science of meaning, at least, or the science of forms of communication and of signs and stuff like that. And that in itself is a whole other kind of gamut, where it's like you're taking the content out of the communicating thing, and you're just looking at the means of communication of an idea, and you can do that with anything. And I think that's what Barth was kind of getting at in that mythologies book that I think I showed you. And he had a little article in it called Myth Today, in which he kind of discusses the idea of semiology in it. And he says, like, look, anything can be a myth, or anything can be a thing that is loaded with meaning if you look at it through this lens. So I think maybe with everything that we're talking about, we're talking about opening the windows, but maybe it's also maybe it's something like we just have to find the right lens to see things correctly, or maybe we were using the wrong prescription glasses, or maybe our eyesight was kind of like it was okay, and everything we saw we just took as reality, and we're just like,
what do you think?
It is what it is.
I mean, since we've started doing this and whatnot, I mean, where do you have any hunches about where the future of philosophy may be? I mean,
you mean just in general?
Yeah, see, yeah. I mean, I guess what I'm saying is I think you're making me more optimistic about the research opportunities now.
Yeah, I mean, because there's also the idea, I think, I don't know if studying culture, or like today's culture, is much of a thing that philosophy gets today. I don't know. I'm not into it as much as you are. So I don't know if that is a very popular thing, just like studying. I feel like
it's kind of frowned upon.
Really? Why?
Yeah. It's kind of, I think for a number of reasons, perhaps how it's done, and perhaps people think people are still sort of ossified in the traditional ways of doing things. That, like, if you were to apply all that philosophical erudition to pop culture, that it would seem like a misappropriation of great intellect. It would be like,
but why you're studying the society? You're studying your present age. That's what I mean.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's correct. I mean, one of the greatest philosophers that I've ever read was a tremendous critic of her time, and that was Hannah Arendt.
Yeah,
you know, she, she just kind of started to pull at this little thread, trying to understand how a society such as the German society could become so utterly corrupt.
Mm-hmm.
And she just kind of just kept tugging at it until she really kind of reconceptualized evil, calling it banal, and which was a radical tension that she sort of advocated. And I would say she was a thinker that really perhaps transformed the way I think about things. And maybe we're just waiting for another Hannah Arendt to do that with the 21st century.
No, because I mean, I think especially this century now with the internet and social media and phones and this and that, I feel like all of that is so loaded with dilemmas, both existentially, morally, philosophically.
Yeah,
I mean, it's begging for further insight and maybe exploration. Not that people are already doing that already. I'm pretty sure they are. But even within certain fields like literature and music, I mean, maybe
it's definitely on the fringes. Yeah.
Yeah, where maybe that's where I don't want to say like I see the future of philosophy in this, but at least thinkers that have fascinated me, and maybe they're not necessarily philosophers, but people that have kind of looked at their time and tried to have not an opinion about it, but tried to look at it through different lenses. Umberto Eco is a pretty cool thinker for me that did that. I mean, he wrote a lot of fiction, but he also did like non-fiction essays and stuff. And he made one little essay titled "The New Middle Age," and he made this argument that the time that he was living in, like the 80s and like modern day, was like just like a kind of, it was more compared. He compared it more to the Middle Age than maybe let's be like, oh, it's like a second Renaissance already. He's like, no, it's actually like a Middle Age, and I'm going to tell you why. Not in a negative sense, but just in the sense of how culturally, just maybe even about military politics, that it all kind of related back to that. So I think maybe the future is just kind of the future is now. I think the future is now, at least in maybe terms of philosophy. Maybe that's...
Yeah, well, I think it's been a very productive conversation in regards to that. It is getting a little late, so I do have to wrap it up. But I think you kind of got me to do a 180, and it was totally unscripted. I suddenly have a sunny disposition in regard to my in regards to future philosophical projects, and maybe that's helpful to someone else. Maybe someone else felt pretty gloomy about the future of philosophy, but I like that we keep kind of returning to this theme about the future of philosophy. I mean, I think
it's just the future of ideas in general, whether it be philosophical, musical.
Yeah. It's
the future of ideas we're kind of talking about.
Well, I think it's been kind of. I think it's been kind of cool. I think it's been kind of cool when we do these off the cuff podcasts that they're sort of organically grouping themselves into sets, and there's a coherence to them, a continuation of them. So I like that. It's kind of interesting. I didn't anticipate that to happen, but it seems to be happening, and it seems to be emerging.
Awesome.
So cool. We'll keep doing that. All right. See you later, guys. Bye.
Thank you.